My fiancé left me at the altar because a coworker said she liked him. When he came back 3 years later, thinking I'd be waiting, I shut the door in his face. I was standing in a room at the back of the church in my dress with my bouquet in my hands when Miriam came in and told me Mitch wasn't coming. She said his best man Greg had just called her from the parking lot. Mitch sent Greg a text 20 minutes before the ceremony saying he couldn't go through with it. He didn't call me. He didn't come to the church. He sent the text to Greg and let Greg figure out how to handle a church full of people and a bride in a back room. 140 people were sitting in those pews. My dad had taken out a loan to help pay for the reception. My grandmother flew in from Puerto Rico, and it was the first time she'd been on a plane in 11 years. My bridesmaids had taken days off work, and Mitch sent a text to his best man from his apartment while I stood in that room waiting to walk down the aisle. I didn't hear from him for almost 2 weeks. When he finally reached out, it was through an email. He said the night before the wedding, a coworker named Tara told him she had feelings for him. He said it hit him like a wall and made him realize he had unresolved emotions he needed to sort out before he could commit to anyone. He left me at the altar because a woman he sat next to in an office told him she liked him the night before our wedding. I didn't respond. I returned what I could from the wedding. My dad never talked about the loan again. My grandmother went home and didn't mention Mitch's name once. I found out 4 months later that Mitch and Tara had dated briefly, and it didn't work out. She told him after a few weeks that her confession had been more of an impulse than anything real. He left me on my wedding day for an impulse. Over the next 3 years, I rebuilt everything he blew apart. I paid off the remaining wedding costs myself so my dad wouldn't carry it. I got promoted twice at work. I moved into a better apartment. I started running, which turned into something I actually loved. I met a man named Gio at a friend's birthday dinner about a year and a half after everything. He was kind and consistent and showed up when he said he would. We took things slow because I needed slow, and he never once made me feel like that was a problem. The first time I told him about the wedding, about the text to Greg, about the email 2 weeks later, he just listened. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't ask if I was over it. He just sat there and let me say everything I needed to say. By the time Mitch reappeared, Gio and I had been together over a year and had just started talking about moving in together. 3 years and 2 months after the wedding that never happened, Mitch showed up at my apartment on a Saturday afternoon. I opened the door, and he was standing there with his hands in his pockets looking like he'd rehearsed whatever he was about to say. He told me he'd made the worst mistake of his life. He said he'd spent 3 years thinking about what he did, and he knew now that I was the one he was supposed to be with. He said if I gave him one more chance, he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me. I asked him what exactly he thought was going to happen here. He said he knew me, and he knew I always believed in second chances. He used something I once told him about myself as a tool to get back in. That's the thing about people like Mitch. They don't hear what you tell them as something you're sharing. They hear it as inventory. They keep track of every soft spot, every belief, every story you ever told them about yourself, and they file it away for the day they need to use it against you. Then he said the situation with Tara was something that happened to him, not something he chose. He said he panicked and made a snap decision he regretted immediately. He called walking away from our wedding a snap decision, letting 140 people sit in a church waiting, letting my father eat the cost of a reception that never happened, letting my grandmother fly across the ocean for nothing. He called all of that a snap decision like it was the same as choosing the wrong thing off a menu. I told him about Gio. His face changed. He asked how long, and I told him. He asked if it was serious, and I said yes. Then he looked at me and said, I just think if he really knew you the way I know you, he'd understand why I'm here. It was possessive and dismissive of Gio all at once. Like Gio was temporary and he was permanent. I felt something hot flash behind my ribs. Not sadness, not hurt, just clean anger. The kind that doesn't make you loud, the kind that makes you still. I said, you don't know me. You knew a version of me that doesn't exist anymore because you killed her. Mitch flinched. Then he took a breath and put on a calm, measured voice. He said, I've been going to therapy. I've done the work. I'm not asking for everything at once. I'm just asking for a conversation. Coffee. Just 1 hour. He said, just 1 hour, like 60 minutes of my time was a small thing to ask for. Like he hadn't already taken so much more than that from me. He was performing humility, but every word was still about what he wanted. Not once did he ask what I wanted. Not once did he ask if I was okay. In his head, the only possible ending to this story was me saying yes. I said, I don't owe you an hour. I don't owe you a minute. I don't owe you a single word, Mitch. You sent a text to Greg. You didn't even have the guts to face me that day, and you think showing up 3 years later makes you brave? This is just you running out of other options. His face crumbled. For a second it looked like he might actually hear me. Then he rebuilt his face in real time and said, I know you're angry. I deserve that. But you used to tell me that holding on to anger only hurts the person holding it. He was reaching back into who I used to be and pulling out my own words and using them against me like a weapon. I said, don't you ever use my own words to manipulate me again. Then I stepped back and closed the door. I turned the lock. I decided not to tell Gio. I didn't want to give Mitch space in the life I'd built. That was my mistake. A man who sends a breakup text to his best man 20 minutes before his own wedding doesn't understand the word no. 3 days later, Miriam called. Her voice was tight in a way that made my stomach drop before she even said anything. She said, Mitch just messaged me on social media. He wants me to talk to you for him. He wrote, I know she listens to you. I just need someone to help her see that people can change. I told her to block him. She had already done it. Then she asked, did you tell Gio? I closed my eyes. I said no. She said, you need to tell him. If Mitch is reaching out to me, he'll reach out to other people. You don't want Gio finding out from someone else that your ex is circling. She was right. I knew she was right the second the words came out of her mouth. But knowing she was right and wanting to actually have that conversation were two very different things. I got off the phone and finished making dinner, but I didn't eat any of it. I just moved food around the plate and thought about how I was going to tell Gio without making it bigger than it needed to be. The thing is, it was already big. Mitch had shown up at my apartment, I'd shut the door on him, and instead of going away, he'd gone around me and contacted my best friend. That's not a man taking a hint. That's a man making a plan. That night, I told Gio everything. Mitch on the doorstep, what he'd said about knowing me better than Gio did. The door, the lock, the message to Miriam. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When I was done, he said, why didn't you tell me when it happened? His voice wasn't angry. I told him I didn't want to give Mitch power over our life together. I said Mitch didn't deserve of space in our home or in anything we'd built. He nodded slowly, then said, I get that, but we're a team. You don't have to handle things alone anymore. Because for 3 years, alone was my default setting, and I didn't even realize I was still running on it until Gio pointed it out. He sat there for a minute, then asked, do you think he's going to stop? I said I didn't know. The next day, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was Greg, the same Greg who got the text in the parking lot 3 years ago and had to walk into a church and figure out what to say to 140 people. He sounded tired. He said, Mitch has been calling me nonstop. He keeps saying he just needs one conversation with you. I told him to leave it alone, but he won't listen. Then he said, I was the one who had to tell everyone at the church that day. I lost friends over it. I don't want to be in the middle of this again. I told him, then don't be. Tell him I said no, and if he contacts anyone else in my life, I'll consider it harassment. Greg said he'd pass it along. The way he said it, quiet and flat, told me he didn't think it would work either. That weekend, Gio and I went out to dinner. It was supposed to be a normal Saturday night. We walked in through the front door and I saw him immediately. Mitch was sitting at a table near the entrance, alone, with a glass of water in front of him, watching the door. He wasn't eating. He wasn't looking at a menu. When he saw me, he stood up. My whole body went cold. This wasn't random. He knew we'd be there. He'd either been watching my routine or he'd been asking people where I go on weekends, and I didn't know which was worse. He walked toward us with his hands up slightly, like this was casual. He said, I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want 5 minutes. Gio stepped slightly in front of me and said, she told you no. You need to leave. Mitch didn't even look at him. He looked past Gio, right at me, and said, are you really going to let him speak for you? That was the moment I understood completely what this was. Mitch wasn't here because he loved me. He was here because I told him no and he couldn't accept it. I said no, so he went to Miriam. Miriam said no, so he went to Greg. Greg said no, so he showed up at a place where I was supposed to feel safe. He wanted me alone because alone is easier to manipulate. He wanted me without Gio because Gio is the living proof that I moved on, and Mitch couldn't stand to look at that proof. That question, are you really going to let him speak for you, wasn't about my voice. It was about control. He was trying to make me feel small for letting the man I loved stand beside me. I didn't say a word. I grabbed Gio's arm and we walked out. In the car, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from fury. I looked at Gio and said, I'm calling my dad. When I told Dex what was happening, the phone went quiet a long time. My dad still carried the weight of that loan. He never complained about it, but I knew it changed things for him. Then he said something in a voice I hadn't heard since I was a kid, the one that meant someone had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. He told me he'd take care of it. I told him no, this was my fight, but I needed him with me when I finished it, because I wasn't running from Mitch anymore. The next time he showed up, I was going to say everything I'd been holding in for 3 years, and he was going to hear it with witnesses. I called Miriam and told her the plan. She said, he followed you? That's not romantic. That's a man who thinks you're a thing he misplaced and now he wants to pick you back up. I told her I needed to confront Mitch one final time. Not in public where he could spin it. At my apartment. On my terms. With Gio and my dad in the room. Not because I needed protection. Because Mitch had spent 3 years telling himself a story where he was the hero. And I wanted witnesses when I tore that story apart so he couldn't rewrite what happened afterward. Miriam said, good, end it. Then I called Greg. I said, tell him I'll give him his 5 minutes. Saturday, my apartment, 2 o'clock. Greg sounded relieved. I didn't tell him Gio and Dex would be there. I wanted Mitch to walk into that apartment thinking he'd won. I wanted him to believe that showing up at the restaurant and contacting my friends and being persistent had worked. I wanted him to walk through that door with hope on his face so that when he saw who was waiting for him, he'd understand exactly how wrong he was. That night, I sat down at my dining table with a notebook. I didn't write a speech. I wrote a list. Not an emotional list. Not how Mitch made me feel or why I was angry. I wrote down numbers. Real numbers. The dollar amount of my dad's loan. 14 months. How long it took me to pay it off. $312. My grandmother Emmeline's plane ticket. Round trip. For a flight she took for the first time in 11 years. My bridesmaid's sick days. The deposits. The flowers. The cake. The photographer. Every therapy session I'd paid for out of pocket. Every week I sat across from a stranger trying to understand why the person who was supposed to love me the most couldn't even show up. When I was done, the list took up almost a full page. I wasn't going to read it to him. I needed to see it all in one place so I wouldn't soften when I stood in front of him. The truth had a price tag, and he was going to hear every cent of it. Saturday morning, I woke up calm. Not the fake calm where you're pushing everything down. Real calm. Gio arrived before noon and sat on the couch. Dex showed up at 1 o'clock sharp in a button-down, sleeves rolled up, and sat at the dining table with his hands flat on the surface and waited. Miriam texted at 1:30. Say everything you need to say. Don't hold back a single word. I put my phone down and looked around. Gio on the couch, steady and still. My dad at the dining table, quiet and ready. The list of numbers in my notebook, tucked in the side drawer where I'd left it. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the clock on the wall. Everything was set. 2 o'clock was coming, and this time I was the one who decided how it ended. At exactly 2 o'clock there was a knock on the door. I pulled it open, and Mitch was standing there in a clean shirt, freshly shaved, holding a single flower like he was arriving for a first date. He started to smile. Then his eyes moved past me and landed on Gio on the couch. The smile dropped. His eyes found my dad at the dining table. His face changed from hopeful to confused to something close to panic. He said, what is this? I said, come in. You wanted your 5 minutes. He stayed in the doorway. He said, I thought this was going to be just us. I said, you gave up just us when you sent a text to Greg instead of walking into that church. Come in or leave. Your choice. He stepped inside. I closed the door. Mitch was standing in the middle of my living room and his presence felt wrong, like a stain on something clean. He turned his whole body toward Gio and said, I don't know what she's told you about me, but I'm not the bad guy here. I made a mistake and I'm trying to make it right. That's more than most people do. Gio didn't blink. He didn't open his mouth. He just looked at me, calm and steady, like he was saying without words, this is yours. I'm here. Go ahead. But Mitch wasn't done. His voice got lower, almost like he was talking man to man. He said, I've known her for 6 years. You've known her for what? A year? You're the rebound man. She's settling because she doesn't think she can trust anyone enough to have what we had. I saw Gio's jaw tighten. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. Dex was pushing back from the dining table, his palms flat, starting to rise with that look on his face that I'd only seen a handful of times in my life. The room was a second away from blowing apart. heart. I held up my hand. Gio sat back. My dad lowered himself down. The room went still. Mitch looked at me for the first time since he walked in. I said, "Sit down." My voice came out so steady it surprised me. He looked at the chair across from my dad. He looked at the couch. There was nowhere to sit that didn't put him directly in front of someone who knew exactly what he'd done. He chose the chair. He sat down slowly and set the flower on the table next to him, where it just sat there looking pathetic and out of place. He put his hands in his lap. He looked up at me. I said, "My dad took out a loan to pay for the reception. Did you know that?" He opened his mouth. I didn't let him. It took me 14 months to pay it off. 14 months of extra shifts and skipped dinners because every spare dollar went toward cleaning up the mess you made. My grandmother Emmeline's plane ticket cost $312. She hadn't been on a plane in 11 years, and she got on one for our wedding. And when it didn't happen, she had a panic attack on the flight home. My bridesmaids used their sick days they couldn't get back. They spent them standing in a church that you never walked into. I said, "You called it a snap decision. Here's what your snap decision cost." I went through every number on the list. The deposits, the flowers, the cake that sat in a back room and was never cut, the photographer who showed up to an empty ceremony, the therapy I paid for out of my own pocket. I laid every number out, calm and clear, the way you'd present evidence in a courtroom, because that's what it was. Mitch leaned forward like he was going to say something. I said, "You had 3 years to talk. You have 5 minutes to listen." He sat back. I said, "Do you want to know what it was like, standing in the back room of that church?" I remember every second, the way the fabric of my dress sounded when I moved, the light coming through the window, looking at myself in the mirror and thinking I was about to marry the man I loved. And then the door opened and Miriam walked in. I said, "You made my best friend walk into that room and tell me my fiancé wasn't coming. You couldn't do it yourself. You couldn't call me. You couldn't walk into that church and look me in the eyes. You sent a text to Greg, and Greg called Miriam, and Miriam had to stand in front of me in my wedding dress and say the words you were too weak to say." Mitch was staring at his hands. I said, "It wasn't that you left. It was that you didn't even have the decency to tell me yourself. You outsourced the worst moment of my life to your best man through a text message. That's not a snap decision. That's who you are." His eyes were red at the edges. I turned to what he'd said to Gio. I said, "You walked into my home today and looked at the man I love and called him a rebound. You looked at Gio, who has shown up for me every single day since I met him, and you called him temporary. You tried to tear down the best thing that's happened to me since you left, and you did it because you can't stand that I'm happy without you. That's not love. That's ego. You don't miss me. You miss the way I made you feel about yourself." Mitch opened his mouth. I said, "I'm not done." His mouth closed. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles white. I said, "You told me the situation with Tara was something that happened to you, that it hit you out of nowhere, that you panicked. You've been saying that for 3 years, that things happened to you. So let me tell you what happened to me. I got left at the altar. I had to walk out of that church past 140 people who all knew before I did. I had to watch my dad pretend he wasn't devastated. I heard a small sound behind me, the kind of sound a man makes when he's trying very hard not to cry and losing. I knew it was Dex. I kept going. I had to return gifts. I had to explain to people at work why I wasn't on a honeymoon. I had to sit across from my grandmother on a video call and watch her try to make me feel better when she was the one who got on a plane for the first time in over a decade for nothing. I had to rebuild my entire life from the ground up, and I did it. Without you. So don't sit in my apartment and tell me things happened to you. Things happened to me, Mitch. You were just the person who caused them." The room went silent. The kind of silent that comes after something true has been said, and there's nothing left to add. Mitch sat in the chair like a man with nothing left. The clean shirt, the shaved face, the little performance, all of it was gone. He looked up at me, his voice cracked, and said, "I'm sorry." For the first time since the email and the showing up and the messages and the restaurant, it actually sounded like he meant it. I looked at him a long time. Then I said, "I believe you, but it doesn't change anything. We're done. We were done 3 years ago. You just didn't know it because you never asked." I walked to the door and opened it wide. He passed me without stopping. The lock clicked. I picked up the flower and dropped it in the trash.